Good evening, and let me add my welcome on behalf of the awards team. It does seem extraordinary that Kurt's death was now more than 10 years ago, and I, like Jeremy and others, remember that day so vividly, and so much has happened since then. And tragically, Kurt was not the first journalist to die at the beginning of that decade, and he hasn't been the last. So I wanted to spend the next few minutes reflecting a little on the awards and some of the structural changes to our profession. And those, in my view, have made life as a journalist on the front line probably even more dangerous than they were in the year 2000 when Kurt died. And this is also, rather incredibly, the 9th year of the Schork Awards, which was an idea, and it was a hope and an aspiration that since has grown into an established event in the journalism calendar. And there are many people who've actually made that idea come true, but principally I'd like to thank two individuals at this stage. One is in this room this evening. She's just in this room, having fought her way from Istanbul, and it was touch and go. So this is Sabina Kozic, and her tireless energy and drive to set up a lasting tribute to her partner became a reality. And the other person is stuck in New York. That's our friend Christiana Anandpur, and she has ceaselessly used her influence to badger, hound and harass news organisations, both large and small, to support the awards. And she's been very, very successful at doing that. And I'd also like to put on record my thanks to Reuters, and particularly to the CEO, Tom Gloser, who, when it mattered, stepped up to the plate and has supported us continually from 2000 until now today. But I look back at the entry criteria for these awards when I was preparing for this evening, and I compared what we'd written 9 years ago with what's on the entry form if you apply for those prizes today. And there's no change, actually. It's exactly the same. And it suggests to me that the principle we intended to uphold on those days, those principles were enduring, and they're just as relevant to journalists worldwide today. And just to remind you, it says the awards aim to celebrate the best in freelance journalism and local reporters, showing great courage and commitment to reporting on controversial issues in a developing country or a nation in transition. I remember we argued long and hard about that phrase, but I think it's probably pretty good. It's captured a lot of what happened. And then I look back at the past awards, and you can see them on the website. This is an extraordinary body of journalism. The stories of those winners chronicle a decade of conflict and corruption. And some are written from the Western viewpoint, outsiders looking in, often the freelancers, and some are written from the inside. They portray the local journalist's view, and they really are complementary. There's a book in there. It's just a fantastic body of work. And they have one thing in common, these stories. They have a passion for storytelling, for uncovering the truth, but they share this journalist sense of mission to report on the horrors of war, but also to uncover corruption. And those are the two main themes. The winning entries, they've encompassed those sort of running sores of the decade, if you like, Iraq and Afghanistan, but so much more. Because when I look back, they've chronicled the sad tales of Zimbabwe and Kashmir, the violence of Somalia and of Colombia, and then the murky world of corruption, the underworld, if you like. The very first prize was awarded to a team of Polish journalists who uncovered a very nasty trade in bodies in their home country. And I suppose I asked myself too, why do journalists pursue these stories? And we know why, it's because it matters. And that was the quality that Kurt epitomised, and never more so than in his reporting of the Bosnian conflict. I also dug out the words of Richard Holbrooke, who was then the US ambassador to the United Nations, and who gave a eulogy at his memorial service in Washington in June 2000. And he said, and I quote, "Kurt believed that if he could tell the civilized world what was going on in the most remote parts of the planet, then the world would do something. Bosnia proved him right. He took enormous risks to make a difference." And then Holbrooke used another phrase. He talked about shining the flashlight of truth. And then he said truth in the form of facts. But of course, as Jeremy has just said, and Sean before him, that truth has come at a shocking price. And I went onto the website of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and there are so many different sites like this today. I wrote down the numbers, and I'm going to read them to you, because I think sometimes it's just a good idea to not forget. So in 2000, the year Kurt died, 24 journalists lost their lives around the world. 2001, 37. 2002, 21. 2003, 42. 2004, 60. 2005, 48. 2006, 57. 2007, 67. 2008, 42. 2009, 70. That was the worst figure, according to their calculations, for 30 years. This year so far, 39. 12 of those journalists, including Kurt, worked for Reuters. And I think any of us who watched that WikiLeaks footage of the killing of Namir Nur-Eldin and Saeed Shamar by the US Apache helicopter in Iraq would have been disgusted by the footage. Now, I showed that footage to a group of postgraduate journalism students, because these days that's where I work, earlier in the year, and the room was just silent. Nobody could speak or wanted to speak. One of those journalists was an American, and finally she spoke up and she said, "You know what? My brother served in Iraq, in the army, and he's now serving in Afghanistan." I don't think she knew what to think of that. I don't think any of us knew what to think. And we still didn't really say much. I think we were just shocked. And those two Reuters journalists, they weren't carrying weapons, they were carrying cameras. But of course it's not so black and white, is it? Because the others in the group, some of them were armed. And Reuters, I believe, has changed its policy to say that journalists shouldn't stand alongside people who are armed and who are not in uniform. But, you know, the question I ask is, why did it take 3 years for the truth to emerge? Because it was 3 years. And I know the hard way how difficult it is also to investigate these deaths. When I worked for Reuters, I was in Hebron for Mazen Dana's funeral, Palestinian cameraman, fantastic conflict cameraman. His funeral was in 2003. He was killed by an American tank crew, which mistook his camera for a grenade launcher at the distance of about a mile outside Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Well, I think back to the shelling of the Palestine hotel in April 2003, in which another Reuters cameraman, Taras Prochuk, lost his life. And, you know, I've been trying to think why have things changed? And I think, you know, what I really wanted to say, I think there probably are 3 things which have changed. Firstly, journalists have become targets. That famed neutrality and observer status of the journalist, probably always mythical, has constantly been eroded. And there have been several cases, most of Jeremy knows this, of cars clearly marked press which have been targeted. And we have to ask why. And, you know, is it because journalists themselves have become more partisan? Have journalists become more sucked into conflict? Is it because increasingly we're travelling with the military, embedded? And have we contributed to that problem ourselves? Secondly, is it the technology that's made journalists more of a threat? Instant communication. It means there are few secrets in a war today, and that television image which is relayed immediately from the battlefield can be far more damaging to a nation's military campaign or to the reputation of a commander or an individual soldier in the field. And think back a few years ago when that dispatch would have been in the, I suppose, in the newspaper the next day, or think back 100 years ago when it might have been 3 to 4 weeks before it got into print. Today's power of the media is global, it is immediate, and it is threatening. And I think that's got something to do with it. And thirdly, is it the changing nature of the industry itself, as cost cuts drive more and more journalists into a freelance existence, moving, as I know, looking at our graduates, from one short-term contract to another, just chancing their arm perhaps to get a picture they can sell. And those journalists can't fall back on a powerful organisation like the AP or Reuters for training, for insurance or protection. And they can't rely on a pooling deal, and to be quite frank, they're exposed. They have to rely on, I must say, a growing band of organisations and charities that have sprung up to help them. INSEE, DART, IWPR, Rory Peck. There are organisations. But I have 4 suggestions for us. I don't know what you think about these, but maybe the panel will pick up on some of them. Firstly, I think we need to recognise that as journalists we have a moral obligation to do whatever we can to run training for this new generation of journalists. Freelancers, locals, citizen journalists, whatever you call them, not necessarily working for the big organisations. They need to be aware of the dangers, they need to have training made available to them. Secondly, we need to work with the military to ensure that they understand how journalists work. They're trained. And there's evidence that although the commanders, the American commanders on the ground, when they were moving into Baghdad in 2003, knew the Palestine Hotel was the base for all the journalists. The tank crew didn't. They hadn't been told. Basic error of communication. Thirdly, I think we need to ask ourselves, probably all the time, I don't know, sometimes we forget whether the story is worth the risk. It's been alluded to already. Some clearly are worth the risk and some clearly aren't. But it's always easy to tell with hindsight. And actually, that's the problem, because we don't know until it goes wrong. Fourthly, we need to confront authority. The killing of a journalist is unacceptable in any circumstance. And we need to make that absolutely abundantly clear. We should never accept the first explanation, or so often what's been a lack of explanation. So I'm sorry to get heavy there. I passionately believe that. I think it's time we did something. So addressing those priorities would be probably the best memorial we could give to Kurt and to all those who lost their lives.